We're about to get into CSEC geography, and today's topic is natural resources. I am Dr. Robert Kinlock, and I'll be guiding you through the lesson. Let's get into it. Today, the objectives of this lesson will center on the natural resources. We're going to be looking at some of the factors influencing the location of industries as it relates to the natural resources that these industries depend on. More specifically, we'll be attempting to differentiate between renewable and non-renewable resources. We're going to define the term natural resources. We're going to name and locate areas within the Caribbean that have specific natural resources that are used for commercial purposes. And these could include things like, fishing resources, forestry resources, limestone or bauxite. And then we're going to explain some of the factors that affect the location of these industries. And our specific focus today will be on primary industries. In later lessons, we will get into the factors influencing the location of secondary and tertiary industries. We're going to finalize the lesson by looking at sustainability and the extent to which the practices that we have witnessed in our Caribbean region, the extent to which some of these practices represent sustainable extraction or sustainable use of these resources. So to start, we have to first understand what we're talking about when we say natural resources. What we mean by that? A natural resource is simply the materials or substances that occur naturally. And these are usually extracted for economic gain. Certainly within the context of our CSEC syllabus, when we're talking about natural resources, we are looking really at those natural resources that we derive some economic benefit from. And if you think about all the industries we spoke about the last time, they depend on natural resources in some way, shape, or form. Some depend on it directly, particularly the primary or what we call the extractive industries. They depend on it directly. So farming depends on the soil. It depends on the availability of water. It depends on the climate, the weather, and all of those constitute elements of natural resources. Now, natural resources can be classified into two groups. These broad classifications are renewable resources and non-renewable resources. And these definitions are very, very simple. When we think about a renewable resource, we're thinking about any resource that can be replenished with the passage of time. And some of the examples of renewable resources are things like our forestry reserves, like wood. Solar energy can easily be it is continuously replenished and created. Well, not created, but it's constantly replenished. It is wind energy. So all of these constitute natural renewable resources because they can be renewed quite easily with the passage of time. And some of you might be asking, but so can't everything be renewed with the passage of time? Well, not really. There are some resources that we call non-renewable resources, and these cannot be replenished with the passage of time. And when we're talking about the passage of time, we're talking about in the hundreds of thousands to the millions of years. Something like oil, for example, petroleum, takes about 50 to 250 million years to develop. So most of our petroleum deposits on Earth are extremely old, and so they will not be replenished in any of our lifetime. And so it is considered to be a non-renewable resource, cannot be renewed. Now, the Caribbean is rich in natural resource deposits. When you think about it, our economies depend quite extensively or quite significantly on natural resources. In some regards, we depend a lot on forests. Some countries like Belize and Guyana and Dominica, they have very significant forest reserves and it contributes quite significantly to their GDP through lumbering and other industries. In other contexts, places like Belize have a very well-developed fishing industry. Guyana also has a very well-developed fishing industry. We also extract across the Caribbean resources like limestone, and we take that from places like Jamaica and Barbados, and so petroleum and Trinidad. Trinidad is famous for their petroleum deposits. Natural gas also, we have very significant natural gas deposits in Trinidad, and of course Jamaica is known for its bauxite deposits, but also Guyana and Suriname are also known for their bauxite deposits. Now you'll notice in the combination of resources that were presented, you have different, you have some of them that were renewable, so Trinidad and some that were non-renewable. So like Trinidad, for example, they depend a lot on a non-renewable resource, which is petroleum, right? Now, the harnessing or the extraction and use and processing of natural resources, these things come together to form the basis of industries. And industries can be simply put as a group of economic activities that might involve the extraction or the processing or distribution of goods and services. And so they tend to coalesce or revolve around a particular activity. Now, most industries have specific needs. And these needs sometimes affect where this industry is located. So depending on the type of product, an industry might need to locate closer to the raw material. You have other circumstances in which an industry might need to be closer to the market, to where it is, distributing these goods to the consumers, right? Or might need to be closer to a point of export or something like that, a trading point. So it really depends on the character of the industry. And we're going to go through some of these examples in a few seconds. Now, the syllabus requires that you understand, that you get a kind of understanding of how these industries can be, how these factors influencing location can be classified, and a basic categorization of it could be what I have indicated here. So they can be divided into physical factors, things like energy and relief and those things, political factors, and human/economic factors, right? And when we think about human/economic, we're thinking even about social issues that affect the location of particular industries. So we're going to get into discussing some of the physical factors first. And some of the more commonly some of the most common physical influences. When we think about physical, we're thinking about things that are more natural, that have to do with the earth, that have to do, with those things. So raw materials, the location of raw materials, the location of an energy source or the supply of energy, and relief represent three of the most important physical factors in determining the location of industries. So in the case of raw material, if the raw material is heavy or bulky, so something like bauxite or sugarcane or coal, these bulky raw materials, they tend to lose weight on production. So when we're moving from bauxite to alumina, of course, there's a significant reduction in the weight of that commodity. Alumina is extracted from the bauxite and then is later processed to aluminum. But when that bauxite is very bulky, the sugar cane when it is cut is very bulky, and so those industries need to be located closer to the source of the raw material. So energy is also very important. Some industries are very energy intensive and need to be located close to the source of an energy input. But what we find is that today the pull of energy is less and less at a local level. But in some circumstances, if you think about it on a global scale, many investors will establish industries or factories or businesses in different areas because of cheaper energy availability. And that is exactly why when we mentioned in our last session that Trinidad actually has a manufacturing sector that's larger than the manufacturing sector for the rest of the Caribbean, it is really because Trinidad has this very good supply of energy compared to the rest of the region. And of course, that energy is from its petroleum resources. Now, relief is also a very important factor. Industries often need extensive areas, and when you look at, let's connect it to some of the lessons you might learn in your map work, and so industrial areas tend to be areas that are very flat areas, especially if these industrial areas an urban area is in like an urban space or just on the fringes of an urban space. These areas tend to be located these activities tend to be located on flat, extensive land. Most industries tend to avoid hilly areas unless the resource, the raw material that they're extracting is in that hilly area. So relief does play quite a significant role. Now, government policies represent one significant political factor influencing the location of industries. Governments do different things to encourage industrial location. So sometimes governments will provide incentives to industries, to businesses to settle in a particular area, to establish themselves in a particular area. Governments may also do things like and some of these incentives might be things like providing land or the infrastructure. Sometimes governments even give these businesses, these investors, tax holidays or tax breaks, right? So these are initiatives that governments use to attract industries to particular areas. So government policy can therefore influence the location of industry. And we have seen good examples of that. In the Caribbean, in the 1970s, going into the 1980s, and of course they eventually closed down for the most part in the late 1990s, what we saw, perhaps in the early 2000s, I could say was the final, kind of nail in the coffin for these industries. But what we had in the Caribbean was the expansion of export processing zones during the 1970s and 80s. These zones were located in port areas, and many of these zones were developed by the government essentially as a mechanism of attracting investors. And so many of the products, many international, multinational corporations and, many of these international entities like Tommy Hilfiger and other brands, for example, they established in the garment industry, and they set up in these facilities there, and they would stitch different pieces of material together, right? They'd import the material. Our workers in Jamaica would be placed there, and they would assemble it, and then they would export that material to their markets in the United States. Now, these are called export processing zones or free trade zones, and they are a good example of the ways in which the government or government policy has actually influenced industrial location through the provision of incentives, of course. So another important component of industrial growth, or for industries to exist, they need capital. So money is extremely important, and money can influence where industries are located. So that money can flow either from the government, or it can flow from businesses or from individuals. And so that capital, if a government does not have capital for development of these types of infrastructure, of these types of industries, then it will certainly hinder the extent to which these industries can be developed. And of course, they won't be located there if there's no capital for that location. So this capital is used in things like setting up the infrastructure and all of these things. Transportation is also very important. And transportation, industries need very good transportation links. Sometimes that transportation links the transportation links need to be such that it provides a very good connection to the raw material in the case of bulky commodities. Sometimes the transportation needs to be such that it can provide good access to the market and good access to the ports and good access even as it relates to the supply of labor, where your people coming from. So transportation is very, very important as a factor that influences industrial location. Now, another important factor is the market, who you're selling these commodities to. Industries all need markets for their commodities. And some industries in the Caribbean export products to nearby countries. Some distribute these products locally. But whatever the commodity, the market is very important. And in many instances, the market determines the location. Now remember, I gave you the example just now about the export processing zones. Our location, our proximity to the United States, which is a major market for some of these commodities that were produced in these export processing zones. Our location close to the United States meant that shipping costs would be lower. It meant that other items, it meant that, so if shipping costs are lower, it would be easier, they would get easier access to the United States market. So in that way, on a kind of global scale, we could see where our favorable location it provides, good market access. So markets are very, very important. And of course, the supply of labor. Factories often need a supply of large pools of labor. Now, let us get into some specific case studies. We're going to talk about fishing in the Caribbean, and then we're going to go into bauxite. Now, fishing is one commonly used primary sector case study. Now, why is the Caribbean? Why is the fishing industry so common or dominant in the Caribbean region? And it is really because we have an abundance of warm waters and a favorable climate and marine conditions provide it enhances what you call the biodiversity of the fish of our marine resources essentially. And what that does is that we have high levels of productivity in our oceans, although as we will discuss in a few minutes, that some of that productivity is actually challenged. And when we talk about productivity, we're talking about it in a natural sense here. Some of that is actually challenged by some of our activities, but we have a lot of fish in our waters. We have abundant fish. And many countries rely on this fishing resource for revenue. So what they will do, some will sell the fish to other countries. They'll export the fish in different forms. The fish will form a relatively important input into, for example, the food processing industry. Sometimes for some countries like Belize, the fish also represents an important component of their tourism industry because people will go on excursions, to scuba dive, and all of these things. But the fishing industry, in a general sense, can contribute or has contributed significantly to GDP in some countries. Some countries like Belize more so than others. Now, it provides employment to over 10,000 persons in Guyana. And when we think about the fact that, this industry provides not just formal employment, and it provides also informal employment. And when we think about informal employment, we think about all those people who would be like fishermen or vendors that are not necessarily registered with the government, or so they're not, so these persons would constitute informal fishers, and they comprise a very, very large component of the labor market that is dedicated to fishing. So As I had mentioned earlier, fishing also provides a lot of raw materials that are used for further processing. It provides a source of foreign exchange as we sell these commodities and gain revenue. And the foreign exchange, of course, and of course this exportation contributes a lot to our gross domestic product, which we had discussed in the previous lesson. And of course, it is a very, very important source of protein, right? So we use it in our in our everyday meals. So I had mentioned the concept of food security to you in the last lesson as well. And the fishing resources that we have in the Caribbean region do to some extent contribute to our access to food and our access to adequate, safe and healthy food, which is considered to be it contributing to food security. Now, what are some of the factors influencing the location of the fishing industry, and how do these factors kind of play into why the fishing industry would be considered an important industry in the region? So one of the factors is the fact that the coastal, we have very shallow coastal waters in places like Trinidad and Tobago and in Guyana, and these shallow waters are rich in nutrients. In areas like Trinidad and Guyana, they have large rivers like the Orinoco River in Venezuela that brings a lot of sediment, a lot of material into the ocean there, and the fish feed on this material, and it enhances the productivity of the fishing population, right? So they breed more, you have greater diversity, more fish will be attracted to the area, and so our fish population will increase, and so it will represent a very, very useful resource for us. In other areas, in both of those countries, as well as in Jamaica and all over the Caribbean, what we have are mangroves. If you drive along the coastline in many sections of Jamaica, if you're in Portland Cottage, lots of mangroves. If you go to Port Royal, you'll see a lot of mangroves as well. And mangroves are extremely important because they provide a habitat for fish and a spawning area or breeding ground for juvenile fish. So because we have mangroves, and because we also have a lot of coral reefs in the Caribbean, coral reef ecosystems in the Caribbean, you will have the fish go into these mangroves, into the roots, they go into the coral, and they lay the eggs there, and so the juvenile fish get protected until they're ready to take on the open waters. And so because of these physical characteristics, our fishing resource is enhanced. Now, what are some other factors influencing the location of the fishing industry? Is the fact that many islands have very good natural harbors, and these natural harbors are good areas for boats to dock and for ports that we use for exporting of commodities. And so there is also a very long tradition of fishing for food and trade in the region, and that also influences the practice of fishing. Now, our engagement in the fishing industry, rather. Now, how is fish marketed? Now, a lot of fish is sold locally. Some of the fish is sold to middlemen, and these middlemen take it to retailers like supermarkets and restaurants. Some fish is sold at local level in fishing villages. You can go directly to a fishing village like Old Harbour Bay, or even if you're in Kingston, you can go directly to Raytown and you can buy fish at the seaside. Many local villages sell it. Now you also have wholesale markets that have developed, and large corporations that distribute the resources of our fish supply. So, for example, in Guyana, you have companies such as the Guyana Food Processing Organization and Guyana Food Processors and Georgetown Seafoods. These companies produce fishing. These companies distribute the products of the fishing industry to the market. Now, the fishing industry is an industry that is exceptionally challenged. Some of those challenges include things like overfishing, pollution pollution by of both the rivers and the streams, as well as destruction of the mangrove communities. Overfishing involves the catching and killing of young fish, which cannot then mature to breed. It often contributes to that. We're also just generally just catching too many of the fish, and that, or too much fish rather, and that contributes to what we consider to be unsustainable practices. If we overfish, then there will be less fish available. So we have to put in place mechanisms, and the government has put in place mechanisms to control that. Now, pollution also affects fish or marine environments. We have seen where sewage and other forms of waste and chemical waste and other what we call biochemical pollutants, these things affect the fish populations negatively. And of course, if we destroy the mangroves, there will be nowhere for these fish to breed. Now, if we were to zoom in specifically on Belize, Belize is a country that has perhaps one of the most developed fishing industries in the Caribbean. It is very developed because Belize has an extensive coral reef in the ecosystem, and in fact the largest in this hemisphere. Now, it has an extensive coastline, which is about 457 kilometers in length, and this coastline has rich mangrove swamps. Now, these mangrove swamps provide very good breeding grounds for the fish. Now, over 1,672 persons are employed in fishing, and most of them belong to a small number of cooperatives that these cooperatives own most of the modern fish processing plants. So the most important products that are fished out of the Belizean waters are things like lobsters, and these lobsters are caught in wooden traps or by divers in the shallow waters. Now, the Belizean fishing industry has been challenged, like most of the other fishing industries in the Caribbean. Now, the fish stocks have declined, and this has resulted, the fish stocks have declined because of overfishing. The fishers go in there, all of these large corporations, they go in there and they just catch too much fish. So, and also, when you have this overfishing and you combine this overfishing with destruction of the coral reefs, that of course affects how much fish will be available. That sometimes the coral reef is destroyed by man's activities, right? We can't say, I'll teach you a big word for that. We call those activities anthropogenic activities, right? So many of these activities, right, could actually destroy the coral reef. So we contribute to when we just decide to clear certain areas, where we decide to perhaps release untreated or poorly treated sewage into the ocean, like what we have seen in Kingston Harbor, for example. Much of the coral reef, there's virtually no coral reef ecosystem, no healthy coral left in the Kingston Harbor, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of the discharge of nutrient rich, and all of these nutrients really come from a lot of the sewage in Kingston. And so those things affect the coral reef, but also coral reefs are very much affected by hurricanes. And we saw in Belize, for example, where a hurricane had destroyed quite a significant portion of their coral reef ecosystem in 2000. Now, various measures have been put in place to protect the industry, and these measures really range from them imposing stricter regulations. So they might decide that they want to close. They might have decided to close the season for particular fishes. I know in Jamaica, for example, we have a closed season for fishing lobster, for example. Our lobster season is April 1 to June 30th, and during that period, you can't catch any lobster in Jamaica. And it is one of the measures that the government here has put in place to limit or to protect the fishing resource. Now, in Belize, they have imposed similar restrictions. They also impose a restriction on things like the weight, right? The minimum sizes. They say that the weight and the sizes. So they say, okay, you have to catch, for certain species, it has to be over a particular size, right? And in that way, they facilitate, or they encourage fishermen to catch larger fish, more mature fish, so they don't kill off, so they don't deplete the stock of juvenile fish, and therefore affect the sustainability of that fishing resource. Now, as it relates to the impacts of the fishing industry on the environment, quite often the methods that some of these fishers use can negatively affect the environment. Some of them might release chemicals into the water that might kill large numbers of fish. Dynamite fishing also kills large numbers, and oftentimes when you have dynamite fishing, you kill more fish than you actually need. Now, another industry that we're going to talk about quickly is the bauxite industry in Jamaica. And this is another primary or extractive industry. Bauxite is a metallic mineral, and when that is processed, it produces alumina. Well, we can extract alumina from it, I should say. We can extract other things, but more commonly we extract alumina. And this is in turn processed to form aluminum. And as you drive through many sections of central Jamaica, you'll see large bauxite deposits, and also you might be lucky enough to see a few bauxite plants. Bauxite is very heavy, and so because it is so bulky, it needs to be located closer to the source of the raw material so that we can minimize the transportation costs. Now, a lot of the bauxite industry is funded by external capital, so external investors, but the government does own a stake in the industry as well, a comparatively minor stake. It relies a lot on good transportation networks like roads and railways to transport many of these commodities. And bauxite plants have also popped up close to the deposits, as I had mentioned earlier. Now, the bauxite industry has faced many challenges, and most of those challenges relate to the fact that there was a decline in the demand for aluminum on the world market. And so we have seen that going down. And also our bauxite industry is challenged by competition from other areas, like other countries like Australia and Guinea. Now, in the bubble, you will see that bauxite plant right beside what we call kind of red mud lake, right? And though that red mud lake represents deposits of caustic soda, which is waste material from bauxite production. Now, bauxite has had a lot of impact on the environment. This mining it contributes to deforestation, so they have to clear the forests to set up these pits, to extract the bauxite. It also releases harmful gases because it uses a lot of heavy equipment. But there's also dust pollution, and dust pollution actually affects many communities that are located just around or in close proximity to bauxite plants. That red mud that you saw in the previous picture, right, is caustic soda, and that comprises quite significantly of caustic soda, and that does contribute negatively to the environment, right? You're introducing a kind of foreign chemical in high concentrations into the environment, and so it leads to things like it affects the fertility of that area. Sometimes the material might leach into the water table below. Now, you have various measures that have been put in place to ensure that these industries are a little bit more sustainable, right? Because of course, if we're extracting, we are essentially damaging our industries, especially our environment, especially if we're dealing with non-renewable resources. And some of the practices that have been put in place in farming would be things like organic farming, where they don't use chemical fertilizers. They use things like manure. They'll use mulching. They'll use various soil conservation techniques, like when they put the soil, when they arrange the land into a series of steps to facilitate soil conservation and limit erosion. We had mentioned earlier where sustainability in the fishing industry is enhanced by reducing, by creating closed seasons, for example, setting standards as it relates to the weight of fish that can be caught, and also setting up areas that people should fish in, right? So our restricted zones for fishing, and they restrict these areas so that, people don't necessarily, so that the fish will get an opportunity to spawn. Now, that is it in a nutshell. We have covered the factors influencing industrial location, and particularly as it relates to primary industries. In our next lesson, we're going to look at secondary industries. But I just want to leave you with two quick questions. The first is, which of the following groups of industries depend on the exploitation of non-renewable resources? Is it A, tourism, banking, or barbering; B, fishing, lumbering, or farming; C, oil refining, smelting, aluminum, cement manufacturing; or D, food processing, garment manufacturing, and furniture making. So which one of these depends on the exploitation of non-renewable resources? The answer would be C, right? Oil refining is non-renewable, aluminum smelting is non-renewable, and cement manufacturing is also non-renewable. Now, which of the following industries, so another quick question, which of the following measures can governments use to influence the location of industries? And the answer to this one is D.